Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Max Hellier was never able to explain exactly what it was that woke him from his normally deep sleep. He could usually sleep through any disturbance. The room was pitch black, and although there was no light of any sort from the window, a faint bluish glimmer permeated the gloom. It was a weird, pulsating reflection of light, unlike any Hellier had ever seen. Then he noticed that the light was surrounding the reflection of the bedroom door in the mirror on the opposite wall. But it was something else that almost made his heart stop beating. For although he could see nobody beside him in the bed, a quick glance to the side showed a definite indentation of the pillow and the outline of a body beneath the blankets. Even worse, there was a sudden, intense coldness beside him, almost as if he were lying beside a corpse. He glanced in the mirror again and stifled a scream of horror. Hellier couldn't see himself reflected in the dark mirror, but there was another man lying there. A burly, bearded, handsome man with a swarthy complexion. And at that instant, Hellier could hear the man's heavy breathing. Then, still in the mirror, he saw the bedroom door open slowly and a woman peer in. Her eyes were fixed on the figure of the bearded man on the bed. Hellier watched as she crept up to the man with a horrible feline stealth and gripped the sleeper's throat with her long, bony fingers. He stared silently at the mirror as she squeezed the last breath of life from the hefty man. Then suddenly, the hideous drama ended. The picture faded. And Hellier was once more alone in the room. Badly shaken by this experience, Hellier wished he had stayed somewhere else. He had disliked the room in the inn in Munich as soon as he saw it, especially the tall mirror that overshadowed the room, reflecting every movement, every tiny disturbance. Hellier, like many people, never slept on the left side of his bed, and now, as he sat shivering in the huge bed staring at the empty mirror, he was grateful for his habit of sleeping on the right. He sank thankfully back into the pillows and tried to blot the dreadful vision of murder from his mind. In the morning, he was not sure that he had either dreamed the incident or else that his tired brain had run riot. He would have left the inn that very day, except that he met an old army buddy walking through Munich. Franz Braun was down on his luck. His heart had always been in painting, but Hellier knew that he had little talent. Braun had no job, no money, and that very morning had been evicted from his lodgings. Hellier offered Braun a meal at the inn and a night's lodging, not only out of friendship. Hellier wanted to see if Braun too would see the strange scene in the mirror. It turned out that now, in 1952, Braun had changed little from his war days. He wined and dined lavishly on Hellier's money and spent the whole evening flirting with the barmaid. Hellier had already gone up to the room when Braun came bustling in. "She had to get back to work," he told Hellier, "so we may as well turn in for the night." Hellier nodded. Braun said, "The girl warned me not to sleep on the left side of the bed. I wonder why." Hellier had not told Braun about the apparitions in the mirror, But Brown was skeptical anyway about supernatural experiences. They settled down to sleep, Brown on the left side of the bed. It was hours later when Hellier woke to find that the room was deadly cold, and in the mirror at the foot of the bed, the bedroom glowed again with that ghostly light. He stared at the reflection. There was no sign of himself or Brown in the mirror, but the form of the heavy, dark-skinned man was once more lying on the left-hand side. Hellier turned to look at the form beside him, but the face on the pillow was that of Franz Brown. Hellier looked back to the mirror, and just as it had on the previous night, the door in the mirror opened slowly. The same gaunt, marble-like face peered in, and with brutish determination, the figure crept towards the bed, its face contorted with malice. The cruel white fingers settled once more on the throat beneath the man's bushy beard. Hellier watched, fascinated, as the woman's hands clasped tighter and tighter. Then, as the shuddering form in the mirror grew still, both figures vanished. Braun had not stirred at all during the drama, but now Hellier turned to his friend and shook him. Brown could not be roused. Alarmed, Hellier snapped on the light, and then he let out a cry of sheer terror. Brown was dead. On his throat were 2 red marks, slowly fading from sight. Hellier's scream roused everybody. The doctor who was called attributed Brown's death to heart failure, but Hellier knew that Brown had been as healthy as a young horse. The next day, he questioned the barmaid who had warned Brown about sleeping on the left-hand side of the bed. The girl looked at him uncertainly before saying, "I was right to warn him, Herr Hellier. The last few people who slept on the left side of that bed died in exactly the same way."
They say that if you look into this pond, the dead who lie beneath its surface will stare into your soul and see the secrets you've kept hidden. They also used to say that if you touch yourself, you'll grow hair on your palms. Well, do you see any hair? Marcus shoved his open palm into Claire's face, smearing his hairless, though sweaty, hand across it. She pushed him away, then kneed him in the groin. He went down, soaking his pants in the pond. Everyone laughed except Marcus, of course. Dirk helped him up, while I stood by and stared into the pond that had, according to the crooked post nearby, once been a fairly large lake. Its surface rippled from the occasional landing of a bug upon a floating leaf, or the near-surface activity of a fish. Otherwise, it was placid, undisturbed, and clean, despite its proximity to the road just behind us. We had only stopped there to take a break from our road trip. Once everyone had stretched their legs and relieved themselves, the latter of which Marcus seemed to have had difficulty after Claire's retaliation, we loaded ourselves and our things back into Derek's car. We drove for a few more hours, with Claire and Marcus bickering the entire time, while Dirk talked to me without pause, as if oblivious to the arguments behind us. We were all friends, but Claire and Marcus could only handle so much of each other before things soured. We slowly passed through the Midwest, stopping at diners, bars, and grills, and steakhouses along the way. When considering our budget for the trip, gas had been the second most important consideration. The first had been the food fund, and its use had been limited to the items that were grease-covered, flame-grilled, or served by portly women who called you sugar, honey, darling, or sweetheart. It was the one thing Claire and Marcus had agreed upon. Everyone was required to gain a few pounds on the trip. A few hours after departing from the pond that had been a lake, we stopped again, this time at a motel where we could rest for the night. I was especially tired, having driven the entirety of the trip, up to that point. It would be Claire's turn in the morning, for which I was thankful, because it meant she wouldn't be immediately next to Marcus. Derek, self-designated driver, would remain in the front seat. As I pulled into the parking lot, I tried to think of something I could offer Marcus in exchange for allowing me to rest my legs across his lap during the next day's drive. The clerk at the front desk of the motel seemed young, younger than us even, but he spoke with an air of authority befitting someone much older. His demeanor was also grave, as if he suspected that we were up to no good entirely based upon our age. We'd been polite with him and hadn't come in howling or messing around, as you'd expect a group of early 20-somethings to do at 2 a.m. While we were set on expanding our bellies, we had sworn off alcohol, since everyone had to take a turn driving at some point. The young man retrieved our room keys almost begrudgingly from their hooks and passed them to us as if offering his very last dollar. Despite his unwelcoming manner, we wished him a pleasant night and headed to our assigned rooms. Claire and I were in one, with 2 beds, while Marcus and Derek were in another, with 1 bed. The arrangement was agreed upon and established by Claire and I. Before they could speak up, the clerk had said he couldn't spare 2 two-bedroom rooms, and we hadn't bothered protesting otherwise. After all, it was a roadside motel, not a luxury hotel where a little monetary pressure could magically induce room availability. We unpacked only what we needed. Claire and I hauled out a PS4 and Derek's monitor and spent the night relaxing in our separate rooms. We had a call on speaker, going for both rooms, to casually communicate whenever it was needed, since shouting through the thin walls would have probably brought down the ire of the clerk upon us. Claire and I played Resident Evil 5, one of the few games on the console that had split-screen co-op. Derek watched Event Horizon on his laptop, a movie he'd seen probably 12 times before, while Marcus played Dead Space on his. Horror, as one might be able to tell, was a shared interest of ours, and the original basis of our friendship. We had all met in a horror literature course in college, and bonded almost immediately. Who could have guessed that real, tangible horror would come to us that night? A horror without name, more potent in its awfulness than any real or fictional thing we'd ever experienced. As Claire and I cleared monstrous, skinless, crawling things from yet another corridor of an underground biomedical research facility, we spoke with Derek and Marcus about the specifics of tomorrow. In exchange for my aforementioned mode of passenger relaxation, I offered Marcus some of my prized oatmeal cookies, which my mom had prepared for me, and only me, she had insisted, prior to the trip. They're home-baked, glazed with buttercream icing, and could probably classify as an illicit substance. They are that damn good. He agreed, as I knew he would. He had tried them before, and it would have taken a stronger man than Marcus to deny the offer. Derek asked Claire if she had memorized the route, and Claire confirmed that she had, although she questioned why she would need to, since he had appointed himself as navigator. We all knew that Derek had done it solely because he hated sitting in the back, where the air conditioning was broken. Regardless of positioning, the frontal vents never sent their cooling flow back there, either. He quickly shushed us, as if the present moment in the movie was some part he'd never seen before. Claire rolled her eyes, and we returned our focus to the game. A few seconds later, when we had reached the area's end, the power of our room went out. Claire and I cursed simultaneously, as did Eric and Marcus a moment later. Marcus, Claire, and I had reason to, having lost our progress in our respective games. Marcus was watching the movie on his laptop and hadn't been interrupted by the outage. Since both rooms had lost power almost at the same time, we immediately, rationally assumed that it was a motel-wide situation. We didn't suspect that only our rooms had had their power shut off. We also agreed not to call the front desk and ask about what had happened. There had been several cars in the motel lot, so we figured the clerk would be getting plenty of calls already. No point in us waiting for the line to clear only to be told that he, or whoever handled such issues, was working on it. A knock came to our door about 2 minutes later. In the interim, between the outage and the knock, Claire and I had started to get our stuff ready for the trip tomorrow. We agreed that even if the power came back sooner than later, we didn't feel like going through the same area in our game all over again that night. Our bags were on our bed and we were loading the equipment back into them. Within my bag was a can of pepper spray, another gift from my mother for the trip. I glanced at the can as I loaded my controllers into a pouch, but thought nothing of it, and zipped up the bag with the can buried beneath cables and plastic. When the knock came, I was sure that it was the clerk stopping by to inform us of what had happened. Claire must have thought similarly, because she hopped off the bed, flicking her phone's light off as she did so. She went to the door, unlocked it, and threw it open. Before she could make a sound, she was snatched up into the air by some long appendage that had descended from the roof of the building. My mind hadn't quite processed exactly what had happened due to the darkness of the room and suddenness of her aerial abduction. So when the appendage came back down, presumably to pull me into the night as well, I remained on the bed, staring at the overgrown limb, outlined in white by the moon's pale glow. It wasn't until the fingers, all three of them, angled inward, past the threshold of the door that I thought to get up and close it. I fell off the bed in my haste, but managed to get up and close the door before the limb could come probing the room. I pressed myself against the door, thinking that the massive arm would try to force its way in, given its size and the accompanying strength, I guess, that it would have possessed. But it didn't bang on the door, nor try to rip it from the hinges. To my surprise, it knocked politely on the wood, even though it could have easily smashed the thing to pieces. Those knocks, that common 7-note rhythm I'm sure we all know, brought me nothing but dread. Its use of that friendly greeting somehow made it seem even more sinister than before. I wanted to call out Claire's name, but part of me, with some morbid sureness, speculated that Claire was already dead. That as the thing above knocked on the door, with one elongated arm, it tossed her bones aside with another. The other part of me was just too damn scared to make any noise at all, even though the thing above presumably knew that there was someone else in the room. Why else would it have knocked? In my completely justifiable absent-mindedness due to the horror of the moment, I had forgotten about the still ongoing call with Dirk and Marcus. Claire's phone had been in her hand, and the call had been placed with it. As I did my best to silence any noises produced by my internal organs, I heard Dirk's voice from above, talking through Claire's phone. "Hey, did you guys drop the phone or something?" I would have screamed out and would have assuredly been heard through the walls if not the phone, but before I could open my mouth, someone else opened theirs. "Oh, yeah. Sorry, can you hear me now?" It was Claire's voice, heard from up on the roof, speaking as clearly and as calmly as ever. Claire, who had just been snatched up by some nightmare-sent hand before she even had a chance to scream. A barely audible sound and the sudden absence of Derek's voice, which had been in mid-response to her question, indicated to me that the call had been taken off speaker. Claire's voice continued to be heard, and none of her responses even hinted that she had been seized by some night-lurking thing. Perhaps a bit too late, I realized that I wasn't hearing Claire at all. It was the creature that had been speaking, perfectly mimicking Claire's voice. My fear evolved into heart-quickening terror at this realization. I felt dizzy, having come to that dark conclusion, and still the horror of that night hadn't yet peaked. From up above, I heard Claire's voice ask if she and I could come over to their room. A moment later it said, "Great, we'll be right over." The call was audibly ended after that. I heard movement from up above, a sort of shuffling and a subsequent groaning from the structure as if it had been relieved of a great burden. The sounds of movement issuing from something massive continued along the roof until they crossed over towards the roofing of the other room. They suddenly quieted thereon, the creature not wanting the boys to suspect its true nature. It hadn't cared if I heard, it knew that I already knew. It took a moment for my paralyzing fear to subside before I ran to the wall. I had considered and dismissed the idea of calling them with my phone in the few steps it had taken. They might not have answered soon enough. I pounded on the wall, shouting through the plaster for them to not answer the door. But coinciding with my beatings on the wall, I heard something calmly knock on their door. Marcus mumbled something, which seemed to have been directed at me, but neither properly responded. The walls seemed capable of blocking more sound than I had originally guessed. I stopped shouting, only so I could hear what was going on. It felt like my body had been drained of all its vitality when I heard the door open. There were no other sounds for a moment, and then I heard Marcus's voice, still close to the wall, call out to Dirk, who had presumably opened the door. I then heard the stresses of their bed springs being relieved, and the footfalls of Marcus as he approached the door. I cried out for him not to go. He didn't respond, and a few moments later, I heard their door softly close. I listened with my ear pressed so closely against the wall that it hurt. For a while, I heard soft sounds throughout the room, things being picked up and set down, sometimes in different locations. Noises that seemed to suggest the room's occupant was examining things, as if the environment was new to them. With my ear pressed so closely, the sudden knock on the wall, though gentle, sounded like a hammer strike. I jerked away from the wall and unintentionally screamed, confirming, if it had had any doubt, my presence within the room. Panic and terror drove me away from the wall and to the nightstand between the beds, where I snatched up the car keys, thankfully still in our room. And then I headed for the door. I threw it open, wincing in instinctive anticipation of some far-reaching three-fingered hand coming down to seize me. But the view ahead showed only the moonlit parking lot. I stepped out, looking quickly to each side. To my left, the wing of the building along which the majority of the motel rooms lay. To my right, the guys' room, and 3 others beyond theirs, with the reception area its separate subsection of the wing. The door to the hotel room was open. In a moment of self-acknowledged cowardice, I immediately decided that all my friends were dead, and that they'd at least want me to survive. Having come to this conclusion with pathetic quickness, I sprinted to the car without a moment's hesitation. I heard a noise behind me, but judged that it had come from within their room. Too far a distance, even for the searching arm. When the headlights illuminated the front of the building immediately before me, I saw something that has given me the darkest, most vivid nightmares ever since. The hand, and the freakishly elongated arm to which it was attached, was still within the room of Marcus and Dirk, probing the space for who knows what. In the white light of the headlights, it was a sickly dark green, like the wet skin of some hellish crocodile. In the earlier moments of mind-consuming fright, where mere survival took cognitive precedence, I hadn't thought to really envision the rest of the entity. Sat crouched atop the building, although I don't know how the obviously and minimally maintained structure supported it. It was enormous, a gargantuan, gargoyle-like fiend. It had one massive arm, the hand of which had plunged into the room immediately below it. Other arms at seemingly random placements along the opposite side of its body, even up to its hideously elongated neck, waved through the air, their hands opening and closing, grasping at nothing. They all did so in unison, as if mimicking the motions of the primary hand that investigated the room beneath. Its head was obscured amidst the gloom that had gone untouched by the headlights and the moon, I saw only a vague, possibly horn shape, proportionately large, angled downward at the building. From what I could see in the darkness, it had 2 forelegs and 4 hind legs, all similar to that great arm in size. Even though every nerve in my body screamed not to, I drove uncomfortably close to the building. It was only for a moment. I wasn't willing to see whether or not that colossal, snatching fiend could pick up a car with its crane-sized arm. The creature remained totally preoccupied with the room. When I sped past, it withdrew the arm, and for a moment I thought it would actually attempt to snatch or strike the vehicle. But instead, the hand entered the room Claire and I had occupied. I saw only a glimpse of Marcus and Derek's room, but it was enough to leaden my foot and send me speeding hazardously across the parking lot, barely dodging the other cars as I fled. Within the room, on the floor near each other, were 2 crumpled forms the size of a basketball. Despite the speed at which I had passed the room and the inconsistent illumination therein, I recognized the colors of the clothing Marcus and Derek had worn. Those 2 hyper-compressed objects, almost perfectly spherical objects, had once been my friends. I cleared the parking lot and turned onto the highway, but some morbid pull turned my attention to the rear-view mirror. Even as I sped away, putting miles between myself and the motel, I could never seem to remove from the mirror the image of that thing perched atop the building, juggling their crushed bodies. I won't go back there, even if the police demand that I show them the exact area myself. I'm sorry, friends, but I won't end up like that.
The tent's canvas door flapped open, and Rena came barging through, her pug face more puggy than usual.
"Well, Sergeant Avery?"
She drawled in that annoying Midwest twang of hers.
"I saw it again. Same as before, like I told you."
Her superior, Staff Sergeant John Avery, regarded her with a petulant eye, then reached across the card table they'd been using as their entertainment center and paused a DVD he had on. A special 25th anniversary edition of The Breakfast Club. "And," he said, oddly working his tongue at a sliver of chicken caught in his teeth, "did you check it out like I said?" 60 minutes earlier, during her hourly foot patrol of the exercise grounds, she'd claimed to have seen something weird within the skeleton of the mess hall tent. An unusual sort of light, like someone with a jittery hand shining a flashlight on the ground. No one was there. Convinced it was just a late hour and desolate setting messing with her head, Avery told her not to worry about it. It was obviously just her imagination fucking with her. If, however, she did happen to see it again, he advised her to Scooby-Doo it, a reference he had to explain in more detail, which both irritated and depressed him. Rena folded her arms across her chest.
"I was kinda hoping you'd come with me."
"Aw, Widow Rena's scared of the big bad imaginary white?"
"It ain't imaginary, Sergeant Avery."
Rena fired back.
"And I ain't scared. I'd just rather not check it out alone is all."
Avery smiled thinly at her. When his section chief informed him he had been selected as the night NCO for the build-up phase of the exercise, babysitting all the expensive equipment housed in various communication tents, he had had hopes of being paired up with someone cool, like a dude with an Xbox or a decent-looking chick. What he got instead was Airman Christine Rena, a nerdy pug-faced redhead from Iowa who loved country music and the Twilight series. On the positive side, she was a hard worker and didn't mind doing the security rounds, which made his life a whole lot easier. "Fine," he said, getting up. Show me. They pushed their way through the canvas door and were immediately greeted by the glare of 2 flood lamps they had set up to illuminate the area around their tent, which served as the main communications tent. Rena started to say something but was drowned out by the rumble of generators and cooling units. Avery motioned for her to zip it, and together they walked out past the flood lamps, where it was less noisy. 20 or so paces onward they stopped, and Avery panned about Camp Zero, the large tent-studded field on the western side of Mitchell Air Force Base where all of the base's war games were played. The object of Rena's angst, the partially erected mess hall, sat in the middle of it all, perhaps 50 yards away, its silhouette barely visible under the soft glow of the moon. "So," Avery said, pointing to the structure. "There?"
Yes.
"And you saw a light, what, sort of moving around on the ground?"
Affirmative.
Avery squinted. "I don't see anything."
Well,
Rena huffed.
it ain't happening right now.
"Of course not," Avery muttered. Then, adopting his best Shaggy voice, he said,
"Okay, Scoob, what do you say we go and take a look-see? It's the mess hall. Maybe there's snacks."
Rena's face bunched up like a raisin.
Huh?
"Snacks," Avery repeated. "'Cause Shaggy and Scooby are always hungry and... Christ, never fucking mind. Come on." Removing his flashlight from his web belt and shining it ahead, Avery meandered through the dark to the skeletal structure. Rena, with her own flashlight at the ready, straggled close behind. When they got to the structure's outer framing, Avery paused and had another look. "Still nothing," he said. Rena kept going, moving inside the assemblage of 2x4s. She halted at the very center and looked down.
Here's where I saw it. It was moving in a funny pattern like this.
She moved her beam along the ground in a figure-8 pattern. After a moment, she stopped and went down on her haunches. "What's up, Scoob?" Avery said. "Find a clue?"
Quit calling me that, dang it.
Rena growled at him. She immediately seemed to realize the inappropriateness of her tone and quickly added,
And yes, sir, I did. Look.
Avery bridled at the "sir" bit, not because he was an NCO and the officers were supposed to be the sirs, but because he was 34 and losing his hair, and being called sir made him feel old. "Okay," he grumbled, taking a knee beside her. "What do we got?" Rena pointed at the spot of grass directly in front of her, which Avery saw was a sooty black color instead of the normal green. Puzzled, he put his hand out and waved it over the blackened area. "Warm," he said with a frown.
Yeah,
Rena agreed.
like someone lit a fire here.
"Then put it out right before we left the tent." Avery was about to tack on, except there's no smoke rising from it, but opted to hold on to that little nugget for the time being.
But who?
Inquired Rena.
You think maybe someone's screwing around with us?
Avery arched his eyebrows and gave it some thought. "Actually," he said, nodding, "there are a couple of knuckleheads in the squadron I wouldn't put it past."
Really?
"Oh yeah. Off the top of my head, let's see, there's Rogers from Corps Services, Collins from Maintenance Control, and Martell from SATCOM." Avery rubbed his chin. "If I was a betting man, though, I'd put my money on Martell." Rena scrunched her nose.
How come? He seems so nice.
"Oh, he's one of the nicest people around, but he's also one of the most devious people you'll ever meet. Being so new, you wouldn't know, but Martell is kind of notorious around base for his prank pulling." Avery shook his head. "And as it stands, he still owes me for this thing I did back in January." A glint of intrigue sparkled in Rena's eyes.
Why? What'd you do?
"The old frozen hat trick," Avery said, chuckling. When he saw Rena had no clue what he was talking about, he elaborated. "I took his OCP cap, soaked it in his office's fish tank, then threw it in the break room's freezer. It worked out perfectly, too. He'd brought his lunch that day and hadn't bothered to look for it until it was time to go home." Rena smiled.
It must have been frozen solid. He had to be pissed.
"Correct on both accounts." The way I heard it, though, he didn't say anything. Just grabbed it, sat it on top of his head, and wore it all the way out to his car. It was snowing then, and you know how far away we have to park sometimes. The parking lot for their squadron was a massive plot of concrete, shared by 5 other squadrons, and unless you got lucky, it was tough to get a spot any closer than a 10-minute walk away.
Pretty mean, Sergeant Avery.
Rena said, standing.
But funny.
It's funny because it's mean, Avery corrected. Snickering, Rena glanced down at the burnt grass.
So, you really think this is him? Sure took his sweet time getting you back, didn't he?
Told you he's devious, Avery replied, getting to his feet. And yes, I'm sure this here is 100% his doing. Rena scanned the shadow-wrapped exercise grounds.
What should we do then?
Avery shrugged. Nothing. Business as usual until I come up with something better. For now, let's just head back inside. I could do with another cup of coffee, and there's that rematch you owe me. Earlier in the shift, he had challenged her to a game of chess, and she had mopped the floor with him, something he was sure was a fluke, even after she admitted to having been captain of her chess club in high school. Rena turned her flashlight off. She seemed relieved to have an answer about the light.
Your funeral,
she said, and together they started back toward the main communications tent. Rena gazed across the chessboard at Avery, her fingers tapping impatiently on the card table. Avery ignored her, choosing instead to focus on the unfortunate pickle he had gotten himself into.
Any day now,
Rena prompted. Avery grumbled. With his king backed into a corner, and her queen, rook, and knight threatening, it appeared she had him licked again. Grudgingly, he conceded victory.
Best 4 of 7?
Rena offered. Avery rubbed his eyes in aggravation. Nah, he said. Kind of getting bored of this game. He checked his watch. It was almost 4. Besides, it's time for rounds, smarty pants. Rena grinned as she got up and pushed in her chair.
Gladly,
she said. When she got to the flap door, she peered back at Avery.
Wait, what about the prank thingy? You come up with any ideas?
Yep, Avery said. No changes. We stick to our routine. Rena's grin disappeared.
That's your big plan?
It is. Think about it. If Martell is still out there screwing with us, then the joke's actually on him. Remember, he's playing in the exercise too. He's got to be out there like everyone else in a few hours to help with the build-up. And then the scenarios kick off around noon. It's supposed to be in the high 90s tomorrow. He'll be dead on his feet by 10. Avery met Rena's eyes. All the same, watch out for any booby traps when you go out.
Booby traps?
New pranky-type stuff, Avery clarified, waving her out. Now shoo. When she was gone, Avery turned his attention to the small LCD TV and DVD player sitting on the card table. He fired up the TV and unpaused the Breakfast Club. The movie resumed where he had last left off, the lunch scene. Ali Sheedy making a Captain Crunch and Pixie Stick sandwich, Emilio Estevez unpacking his giant brown bag feast, Judd Nelson questioning Molly Ringwald on the wiseness of eating sushi, Anthony Michael Hall with his peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off. The Breakfast Club had a special place in Avery's heart. Watching it always reminded him of the 80s, of mongoose bikes and Air Jordan sneakers, of Bruce Springsteen with a bandana sticking out his back pocket, and Michael Jackson with a sparkly white glove, of playing the Pepsi Challenge at the mall and watching MTV when it still showed music videos. More than anything, though, it reminded him of a time when his mother could still remember who he was, back before the EMS crisscrossed her brain with its life-sapping scars. On the screen, a close-up of Ali Sheedy's hair-draped face appeared. Avery paused the DVD there and stared at the image. His mother had a look a lot like Ali Sheedy. He supposed this was another reason he liked the film so much. Careful not to let his gaze linger, the nostalgia he felt was nice, but it also tended to elicit some of his darker memories, like having to watch his mother gradually lose her motor function, listening to her cry as he and his father checked her into that specialized living facility, and of course her death 3 years later. Avery moved his finger to the play button and got the DVD going again. 15 minutes later, a nagging feeling drew his eyes from the screen to his watch. According to it, Rena had been gone twice the amount of time it usually took to complete her rounds. He supposed she might have decided to take a potty break, but something in his gut told him something fishier was afoot. "Martell," he groused, stopping the movie. As soon as he did, a strange noise cut through the night, rising over the clatter of the generators and coolers. Avery started at the sound, which brought to mind those weird shrieks that red foxes back home in Kentucky sometimes made. Only this sound seemed human to him. "Rena," he said, somehow certain it had come from her. The notion drove him out of his seat to the flap door. What, he wondered, could Martell possibly have done to provoke such fear in a grown woman, no less? And further, what did the old boy have in store for him when he went gallivanting out there? Mulling the endless possibilities, Avery readied his flashlight and prepared himself to find out. He figured if he was fast enough, maybe he'd get lucky and spoil whatever Martell had planned. And if not, then screw it. At least he'd get the whole pranking business over with. "All right," he said, and slipped through the flap. Crouching low, he scurried out past the flood lamps and took quick stock of his dark surroundings. The only thing of note he glimpsed was a soft glow coming from the ground within the mess hall structure, right about where he and Rena had discovered the burnt grass. "Go figure," he said, skulking towards it. When he reached the structure, he saw right away that the spot of burnt grass had gotten bigger, easily tripling in size. It was glossier now, more liquidy, like a puddle filled with a luminescent kind of oil. Avery shined his light on it, mystified. When he moved his beam along its leftmost edge, he noticed something was sticking out of the oil. A stout, lumpy mass covered in camouflage. Avery moved closer, and it dawned on him what he was looking at. Rena, laying on her belly with her head and arms submerged in the puddle. "Jesus Christ," he said, thinking that this was a prank. It was the best one he had ever seen, by a long shot. He had no sooner thought this when Rena's body started to convulse wildly, flaying and thrashing as if it was in the grips of a powerful seizure. Avery jumped back at the movement but kept his light trained on her thrashing body. She convulsed for another few seconds before going limp. "Christine," Avery murmured, certain now this was no prank. The girl's body thrashed once more, dislodging itself from the puddle. A beat later, she twisted around and sat bolt upright. Curiously, none of the puddle's oily stuff stuck to her. Avery moved his beam to her face, which was red and blistered, as were her arms and hands. Avery was just about to utter her name again when Rena's head jerked in his direction, and her eyelids popped open, revealing a pair of glassy swimming orbs. After drifting aimlessly for a bit, they settled on Avery, and her jaw dropped open, hanging lower than it should have, as if the mandible had come unhinged. From it a low, keening noise issued, while blood trickled off her bottom lip onto her lap. Aghast, Avery backed up a couple more paces. Rena countered his retreat by standing up in an awkward, unnatural manner. First her hands jerked outwards, slammed onto the ground, and locked straight like support beams. Then her feet drew back and her hips thrust upward in a hard bucking motion, propelling her into a standing position. Once upright, she lingered briefly, swaying like a tree in high winds. After several back and forth, She went still and keened some more. "Rena," Avery mewed, his voice faltering. "What is this? What happened?" A fresh rivulet of blood leapt from the girl's mouth. She moaned and started taking jerky, shambling steps towards him. As much as Avery wanted to know what was going on, his instincts told him to turn tail and call for help, which was exactly what he did. Knowing there was an operational bank of secure telephones at the rear of the main communications tent, he fled back inside and hastened to the phones. He picked one at random and hammered out the number for base security. A security forces technical sergeant named Diaz answered on the second ring. Avery spoke fast. "This is Staff Sergeant John Avery over at Camp Zero. I'm the night NCO here, and something's happened. I can't explain what, but the airman with me, Airman Rena, is injured and I need an ambulance." "What? No, man, this is real world. The exercise doesn't even start until..." All right. Thanks. Out." A bead of sweat ran down his forehead into his eye. As he wiped it away, he heard the sound of canvas rustling behind him. He turned and saw Rena staggering through the flap door. When she passed under the tent's fluorescent lights, Avery realized her injuries were more extensive than he first thought. The skin covering her face, neck, and part of her arms was mottled and bubbly like overcooked pizza, and a piece of her jawbone poked through her cheek. Crimson tears oozed from the wound, and red frost seeped from her mouth. She ambled past the card table and down the tent central aisle. Her movements were still jerky and jittery, but markedly less so than before. Watching her approach, Avery was reminded of a toddler still getting comfortable with their newfound ability to walk. He glanced right and left, seeking an escape route, but found himself closed in by racks of equipment. If he wanted out, he was going to have to go through Rena. "Just stop there, Christine," he said. "Listen, you're hurt, bad by the looks of it. You need to sit down until help arrives. I don't know what that thing out there did to you, but we'll figure it out. I called the BDOC. Security forces will be here real soon." Seeming not to hear, Rena kept coming and coming, her stagger slow and purposeful. More gurgles bubbled from her gaping maw, these coming in long strings. Avery had the impression she was trying to say something. When she closed within 5 feet, Avery snatched a heavy technical manual from one of the shelves to his left and wielded it like a weapon. He repeated his demand for her to stop, but she paid no heed. When she got within arm's length, he said he was sorry and belted her across the head. The blow sent her reeling against a rack of encryption devices to his right. He thought she might go down, but somehow she managed to wheel back around and grab his arm. Avery fought to break free, but Rena merely tightened her grip.
"Let go!"
he shouted. Her swimming eyes locked on his. Instead of letting go, she cast him face first into the bank of secure telephones behind them. His forehead caught the corner of one of the metal shelves, and the darkness leapt up, swallowing him whole. Sirens blared somewhere in the distance. Avery blinked open his eyes and found himself staring up at the stars. His face was hot, and a smell like burnt plastic filled his nostrils. Confused, he craned his neck to get his bearings and saw that he was lying on his back beside the oil puddle. "No," he said, and tried to get up. A pair of hands came flying out of the darkness as he did. They landed on his head, gripping it hard, and thrust it into the puddle. Avery screamed, and a tremendous voltaic jolt rippled through his brain. Everything went bright white, and his mind became infused with the wails of a billion beings trapped in eternity. Amid the wails, something not quite solid grasped his face and tore open his jaw. There was no pain in the act, just a vague popping sensation and the notion of something rushing into his throat. Next, he knew his essence was being pushed into a small corner of his brain, and felt something very old and angry permeating the rest of his gray matter, with parts of it exploring the areas he had never used. Whatever it was, it spoke to him in the language of neurons, and in the matter of milliseconds explained its race's long, tragic story. Avery communicated that he understood its plight, especially the anguish and loss of its own parent figures, and agreed to sleep indefinitely so it might use his body. It thanked him, and then all at once he was dreaming. The inhabitant of Rena's body moved away from the fissure and gazed at the pair of armored monsters with the revolving lights which had just approached. The monsters went still for a moment, then broke open, and two organic creatures emerged. The creatures brandished archaic weapons and made vocalizations that the inhabitant was on the verge of understanding. Studying the armed creatures, the inhabitant considered how very lucky its species had been. After all those millennia spent scratching and digging at the walls of the wretched singularity, they could have emerged anywhere in the universe: a dead planet, a lifeless moon, an imploding star, or more likely the infinite depths of space. But somehow their sage's calculations had pushed them through the fissure here, on this flourishing world, which not only had a sustainable atmosphere but sentient, inhabitable life forms. It was far more than their species could have ever hoped for. Even more providential was the fact that these sentient life forms were not undeveloped. They had speech and weaponry, which meant they were somewhat evolved and probably had achieved some measure of technological advancement. This was good because it would require the inhabitant species less time to build the gateways necessary to return to their home world and retake it from the vile invaders which had killed most of their population and banished the rest to the singularity. Avery's soon body rose from the fissure, newly inhabited, and shuffled to where Rena's inhabitant stood. Another armored monster announced its arrival with bright lights and loud screams. Rena's inhabitant also deemed this beneficial to its needs. Only two of its kind had escaped the fissure so far, and there were many more waiting for their freedom. Since that freedom required the inhabitant a viable host, the more of these creatures that came, the better. The two armed creatures stayed where they were, while the two different ones, bearing some sort of container instead of weapons, came nearer, emitting more vocalizations. The inhabitants of Rena and Avery communicated with each other through gurgles and moved back towards the fissure. When the creatures were within a couple of paces, Rena's inhabitant articulated one of the words it had learned from picking through Rena's brain.
Sorry,
it said, brimming with the corporeal strength it hadn't known for eons. And then it attacked.
The first rays of sun peeked over the top of the trees before I reached the front door. I peered back over my shoulder, squinting against the light as I fumbled to shake the house key loose from the others and slide it into the lock. But time was against me. In fact, I only just managed to push the door closed before daylight overtook me entirely. Confounded 12-hour shifts. I sighed and leaned back against the door to give my eyes time to adjust to the relative darkness. I'd been the surgeon on call after hours for years, but ever since COVID hit, it had become more of a permanent assignment than simply filling in the gaps. In fact, I'd been on night shift for so long now, I'd almost forgotten what the sun looked like. Once I could see again, I dropped my keys on the table, almost at the same time Dorian, my taskmaster, greeted me with a rub against my shin and cursed me with an angry mew. Placing my briefcase and bag of groceries beside my keys, I turned to Dorian. Yes, I know you're hungry, little miss. She sat down on the floor at my feet, staring up at me with her emerald green eyes, judging me as only a black cat can. It couldn't be helped, madam. I had to stop by the market on the way home. The surgeon taking up the morning shift today was late as usual. Dorian cut me off with a meow and glanced from me to the kitchen. Very well, slave driver. I groaned and headed for the pantry. You are quite right, of course. Excuses don't fill empty bellies, do they? Passing the cupboard, I paused to retrieve a wine glass and set it on the table, earning myself yet another chastisement from my mistress. Now, Dorian, you have your needs and I have mine. Or perhaps you would like a turn at being supper. Dorian's eyes narrowed, but being a cat, reacted only to the tone of my voice. Patience, my pet, I cooed in as soothing a voice as I could manage, but even to my ears it sounded cold and emotionless. To be expected, I supposed. It had been a long, frustrating day, and I simply didn't have it in me to pretend anymore. Everything in its time, and this, dear Dorian, is a time to celebrate. I opened the fridge and selected my finest red, a vintage I laid down years ago. I popped the cork and passed the bottle beneath my nose, filling my senses with its wild, passionate bouquet. Ah, Esmeralda, I groaned as her memory came rushing back. You remember her, don't you? The girl with the red hair, the one from Paris, the dancer? I truly did love her, you know. I glanced over at Dorian, watching me with utter disdain from the pantry door, completely unmoved by my profession of love. Philistine, madam, that's what you are, a complete barbarian, I told her, but shook the memory from my mind regardless. Though you are quite right, there's no use living in the past. I tipped the wine to my glass, filled it to the brim, and put the bottle back in the refrigerator. Tonight we drink to the future, but I was often struck by my companion's wisdom, enough to wonder sometimes if I wouldn't have been better foregoing my pursuit of love entirely and find contentment with Dorian alone. Fearing another outburst from my mistress, I opened the pantry and selected an elegant blend of fish and chicken niblets for my companion, before taking my glass in hand and making for my favorite chair. I do go on, but in fact, cats are magnificent creatures, a trifle judgmental perhaps, but proud and loving in their own limited self-serving way. I had only just settled down in my armchair by the fireplace and begun to ponder how similar Dorian and I truly were when my phone vibrated, chasing me from my reverie. I fished my phone out of the front pocket of my pants just in time to see Dr. Wallace's name and number fade from the screen. So you did find your ID then, I snorted. He should have. I left it where even he could hardly miss it, but I supposed it wasn't his fault. Time is so unforgiving to mortals, and the old boy was getting on in years. In fact, now that I thought about it, we were to celebrate his 64th birthday next week, which reminded me, I too had reason to celebrate. Clara Dane, I said to no one in particular, and swiped a thumb over the screen, bringing it back to life. Dorian hopped on my lap, still licking the last of her supper from her lips as I brought up Clara's Tinder bio. I tipped the phone to show her who I'd selected. What do you think? Do we have a feature? Dorian, for her part, raised her tail, turned 3 tight circles, and lied down in my lap, completely unimpressed. I smiled and lowered my wine glass to stroke her fur with my pinky. In truth, Clara was everything I was looking for. Young, vibrant, with kind, loving eyes. If I knew nothing more about her, it would have been enough. But her bio, the way she described herself, Not the words themselves, mind you. The ache behind them, the emotion, the need she felt to pour out her love on someone, to help them. I scratched Dorian under the chin. She stretched out her neck and purred with delight. Quite right, madam. I took a sip from my glass, set it on the table beside my chair, and typed a message to Clara. She's perfect. It's always been fascinating to me, the little awkward dance we do, the moves and counter-moves, rather like chess in a way. A ritual made all the more complicated by the trappings of the modern world, and yet at the same time, so very much as it has always been. First encounters being of the utmost importance, and while Clara and I had spoken many times via text and phone over the past weeks, such distant relations cannot compare to meeting someone in person. Everything had to be perfect. For tonight, I selected a venue specifically suited to occasion. Public. After all, this was our first meeting, and as Clara favored Italian cuisine, I thought Gib Alto's would do nicely. A fine establishment, but not so extravagant as to seem pretentious, and popular enough to ensure we would not be alone. As per tradition, I arrived early to make certain our reservations did not pass to another and spoil the evening. But time began to linger. A woman's laugh by the door drew my attention, but it wasn't her. I checked my watch. 20 minutes late. Not to worry. I knew she was coming. If I had learned anything about Clara from our text conversations, it was that she put others' needs before her own. That she was late was actually fortuitous. In her mind, the way she thought, the way she was, it would put her in the offender's seat, the position of guilt, making her more amiable and far more forgiving of my own social failings. No, tonight looked to be a great success. As I pondered, the waiter arrived and cleared his throat. Would the sir like something to drink while he waits for his partner? But of course. I glanced up at him. A glass of tonight's specialty, if you please. Yvonne Red. The waiter sniffed and raised his chin in understanding. My pleasure, sir. And a glass of champagne for my guest when she arrives. His eyes flitted to the chair and his face brightened. It only lasted a fraction of a second, but enough to set my teeth on edge. I kept an eye on him as he turned and weaved through the tables on his way to the kitchens. Foolish, really. A failing on my part, I admit, and one I have been unable to rid myself of despite all my best efforts. As a result, I tried to avoid public settings for these meetings. Too many eyes, too many distractions. Damon? A woman's voice asked. The delicate floral scent of her perfume touched me at the same time as her words, a perfect compliment to her light, quiet voice. Indeed, I answered, spinning to face her as I rose. She wore a blue high-cut dress, tight enough to flatter her figure, while at the same time accentuate her modesty. And you must be Clara. Bowing slightly, I stepped around to pull her chair back from the table. The color rose in her cheeks. Thank you. She brushed her black hair behind her ear and her gaze fell to the floor. She tried to pass it off as merely searching for the chair before she sat down, but the tremble of her fingers and slight quiver in her voice betrayed her. Sorry I'm late, she offered as I pushed her closer to the table. My roommate... I silenced her with a shake of my head. Please, let's not start our evening with regrets. Her blue eyes twinkled as I settled down in my seat across the table. You said in your message that you are a nurse at Mercy General? A noble profession, milady. Milady? She snorted and covered her mouth, trying to hide her deepening blush. For a moment I wondered if I overplayed my hand, but then she rolled her eyes and laid her hand on her lap. Not upset, merely flattered, and perhaps a trifle embarrassed by the snort in her lap. Innocent, self-conscious, and kind. My lips tugged up at the corners. I could not have asked for a better beginning. Forgive me, I'm a man of old virtues. How would you prefer I address you, madam? Madam, she muttered under her breath and rolled her eyes again. Then with a shake of her hair, Clara straightened her posture and her voice took on the hint of mock sophistication. A relic you may be, sir, but the old ways are most welcome. For this evening, milady and madam will do fine, but in the future, please do me the honor of using my given name. I lifted my water glass in tribute to the old ways, Madame Clara. She raised her glass and tapped it against my own, beaming. May the relics of the past never die. I nodded my agreement and drank to my own longevity. The next few weeks fell into place rather neatly. She worked during the day, I at night, so we met after dark every Saturday evening. We discussed many things. Clara was as open and kind as her picture on Tinder suggested. It wasn't long before she was comfortable enough to divulge even her darkest memories, namely, that when she was a little girl, she lost her father and brother Chris in a car accident. It was a simple enough story. She was 5, her brother 4. From what I gathered, it was one of those dreary nights in late October, raining but on the edge of ice, when a stag broke cover and ran out in front of the car. Her father's reaction was to swerve instead of brake, and he lost control. Clara was thrown clear when the car rolled and forced to watch, to listen, as her loved ones burned to death, trapped in that pile of twisted metal. Oh, how she cried when she showed me the scars marring the flesh across her palms, the cuts and burns she suffered as she clawed at the wreckage, the marks that never let her forget the horror of that day. I pulled her to my chest and wound my fingers through her hair, comforting her as best I could. But there are no words that heal the past. I simply held her in my arms, stroked the back of her head, and whispered gently in her ear how sorry I was until her sobs choked into silence, until her body stopped shaking. When her breath steadied, she whispered, "It was my fault," into my shirt. "I should have been in my seat, but Chris, he took my doll." I unbuckled and crawled over the seat to get it back. Dad saw me in the mirror. Her fingernails dug into my back. He only turned around for a second, and whatever composure she fought to maintain crumbled in that moment. I've never been good at empathy, but for her sake I tried. I imagined what it was like being there in her place. The shower of glass, the screams, shock and disorientation as the car rolled over and over. But that's all I could do. Imagine. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but it wasn't your fault. It was an accident. There is no reason to carry that guilt, Clara. Deer appear out of nowhere, and on those conditions, in the dark? I shook my head. Your father was only human. Even if he wasn't distracted, he would have reacted the same. Listen to me. It is not your fault. I know that now, but try explaining that to a 5-year-old. And I know it's stupid, but it still feels like it is. She sniffed into my shirt and tipped up her head to look me in the eye. Anyway, that's why I became a nurse, to sort of make it right, if that makes any sense. Her jaw clenched, her brow peaked, and her lips broke into a strained-looking smile. You probably think I'm crazy. Not at all. I pushed her away, cupped her face between my hands, and wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. You turned your pain into another's blessing, tragedy into mercy. As I said before, it's a noble path you've chosen, Miss Clara, akin to the deeds of the saints of old. Me, a saint? She coughed out a laugh. I told you, no miss, no anything, just Clara. All right then. I whispered and bent down so close I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheeks. Just Clara, I whispered, and before she could react, gently pressed my lips to hers. Her body went rigid, but it only took a moment for her to relax, her mouth to open to my kiss. When it had, I slid one hand around the back of her neck and slipped the other down to her lower back. She moaned softly as I stroked the little hairs behind her ear, teasing her skin into goose pimples. She was mine now, eager for more. But I already went as far as I dared. I learned long ago to stay my hand in times like these. Only a fool presses his advantage in the game of love. No. Old saying is quite true. All good things to those who wait. Time marched on as it always does. Clara and I shared many conversations, many long starlit walks with her hand in mine. And I confess, I shared more of my past with her than I had with any other woman that came before. Until at last, months later, when I just opened my final bottle of Esmeralda and realized it was indeed time to bring her home. I pushed open the door, dropped my keys on the table, and backed out of the way, offering Clara a little bow as she entered my home. Welcome to my humble abode. She dipped her chin as she stepped over the threshold, meek and curious. Her focus darted from the war hall on the right to the Zulu war mask a little farther down on her left, dissecting the remnants of my past with each flick of her eyes. Wow, she gasped, walking a little further in. So many relics. It's like being in a museum. No way. She trotted down the hall and crouched by the display case just inside my living room. I thought you were lying. Is this really his surgical set? She traced her finger along the edge of the glass, practically quivering with excitement. The actual René Laennec? I walked up beside her, unlocked the latch, and removed the scalpel from its place. The very same. I palmed the handle, my hand falling around the hilt in a familiar, practiced movement, before turning it over and offering her the chance to inspect the blade herself. It's like 10 inches long. She pulled her lower lip between her teeth and lifted the knife from my grasp. Can you even imagine what it must have been like? She breathed, taking in the length of the instrument. Doing surgery with daggers like these? That one is for amputations, I offered. Her gaze lifted from the scalpel to me, then returned to the knife in her hand. Hence the length of the blade, but in some ways these instruments are far superior to their modern counterparts. Feel the balance, the way it comes alive in your hand, and of course it's silver, which serves as a natural counter to biological contaminants as well as killing werewolves. She laughed, cutting me off as she swiped the scalpel through the air as one might a sword. Like Van Helsing. She stepped back, grinning, and pointed the knife at my chest. Stay back, monster. I smiled and raised my arms in surrender. Careful, madam, it's still quite sharp. And besides, Van Helsing hunted vampires, not werewolves. I lowered a hand, palm up, indicating for her to return it to me. Ah, she snorted, then slapped the hilt into my palm. So, silver's useless against a vampire? Indeed. I wiped the flat of the blade against my sleeve to clear the oils of her skin from the surface, tucked the scalpel back into its place, and latched it safely back inside the case. Everyone knows killing a vampire requires driving a wooden stake through his heart. None of the legends mention silver. She bent down, still transfixed by the medical history behind the glass. I just can't believe I'm actually dating the great-great-grandson of the René Laennec. Her eyes shone when she turned her focus on me. A whole family line of first-class surgeons. And that's when Dorian entered the scene. She slunk out of the kitchen, head held high, as though the house was hers, and Clara and I were only barely welcome. Ah, yes. I catch Clara's eye and nod to Dorian. I do believe I told you that you were not the only woman in my life. This, my dear, is my companion, Dorian. Dorian, ever ruled by disdain, strode past Clara, ignoring her entirely. She sat down at my feet with a rather indignant-sounding mew and stared up at me expectantly. "Yes, madam," I sighed and squatted down beside the true mistress of the house in order to quell her wrath with a stroke of her ears and back. "I must again beg your pardon, it seems, but you see, Dorian, the blame does not rest with me entirely this time." Dorian turned her head, blinked at Clara as though she were inspecting a rather disgusting insect, and resumed pretending she didn't exist. I tapped the end of her nose with my finger. "Oh, come now, madam. You're being terribly rude." I glanced up at Clara just in time to watch her mouth twitch up at the corners. "Forgive me, Dorian," she said with a curtsy. "I had no idea we were delaying supper." Unbuttoning her purse, Clara reached into the bag and pulled out a small bit of dried cat jerky. "I hope this doesn't mean we can't be friends." Dorian, apparently won over by the tidbit, if not Clara's undeniable charm, abandoned me instantly. She trotted over to rub her leg in the most unabashed display of betrayal I'd seen in many years. "Turncoat," I muttered under my breath as I watched Dorian finish the treat and flop over on her back for a belly rub. "A regular Benedict Arnold, madam. If this was a time of war, I'd have you flogged." "Damon," Clara pouted in a childish scold. "I'm surprised at you keeping this itty-bitty kitty waiting when she's so hungry." As if the two of them had forged some mystical feminine bond in the last 20 seconds, Dorian cast me an icy stare and punctuated the gesture with, in my opinion, a completely unnecessary hiss. I clicked my tongue reproachfully and reached over to stroke her neck. "So that's how it is, eh? I bring another woman into our lives and now I'm outnumbered." Dorian caught my finger between her paws and pulled it to her mouth to chew on my knuckle. All in play, of course. I caught Clara studying my reaction from the corner of my eye and gave my finger a little shake to free my hand from the tiger's maw. "Then I yield, madam. I know when I'm bested, and I dare not risk contending with two hungry ladies." I pushed myself to my feet and offered Clara my hand. "Well, my dear, might I suggest you and Miss Dorian retire to the living room whilst I prepare supper?" Dinner, I must say, went off without a hitch. The Sangiovese harmonized beautifully with the ravioli, once I seasoned with it my own special blend of valerian and oregano. In fact, Clara actually moaned when the first bite touched her tongue. Even her eyelids fluttered. "I've never tasted anything like it. This is incredible." Her shoulders slumped as she surrendered to the sensation, so distracted she didn't notice me carefully push my own supper off my plate and into the napkin on my lap. "I'm glad you approve," I said, once I had removed enough to give the illusion that I'd eaten. "It took years to perfect the recipe, but it's really the wine that completes the alchemy." Her right eye cracked open in a slow, lazy motion, warm and deep, intoxicated. It was a look I'd seen many times, in many a woman's eye over the years. Love. The expression leaked from her eyes, down her cheeks in hues of pink, until it reached the edges of her mouth, where it pulled her lips into a soft, warm, comfortable smirk. "A great surgeon and a great chef," she sighed and reached for her glass. Never taking her eyes from mine, she lifted the wine to her nose, spun the liquid around the base to release the scent, and offered a toast. "To all the great things yet to come." It's an interesting thing how simple, how pure a brief moment can be. Such moments should never be rushed. They need to be savored, for they will never come again. I lifted my own glass, swirling the contents in the same way she had, allowing the moment to linger as I watched my own drink, Esmeralda, swirl thick and slow. But if she did notice the difference between her wine and the thick red liquid in my own glass, she paid it no heed. No, by this point she had completely fallen, blinded by love. I smiled and tapped the edge of my glass to hers. To you, madam, may we enjoy many long years together. The color in her cheeks exploded into full bloom. I watched the smile on her lips spread as she drew back her arm and attempted to hide her face behind her glass. Then she grinned at me over the rim like a naughty child, said, "May we never be parted," and took a sip. Her pupils dilated almost instantly when the sedative hit her tongue, but there was no horror in her eyes, even as consciousness left her. No shock, no hatred. The valerian, mixed with the chemicals in her wine, saw to it that the last thing she would feel was pure, unadulterated ecstasy. I watched her arm twitch twice as she fought against the drug, the glass tip and spill as it rolled from her fingers, her body slump forward and fall on the table. She mumbled something, a question I could only guess at, and then Clara fell silent. I gave Esmeralda a swirl, drank the final remnants of my last romance, and offered Clara a promise. In a way we never shall, madam. I'll remember you always. On that, you have my word. During the next few moments, I retired to the basement to make my final preparations. Once everything was ready, I hefted Clara's body on my shoulder and brought her down as well. I carefully laid her on the mortician's table I had procured specifically for her, raised the head a few inches, and gently fastened the straps around her head, arms, and legs. She moaned, struggling to awake as the effect of the drugs began to wane. I leaned over her head and watched her eyelids flutter. Those beautiful blue eyes that always looked at me with such awe, such love. For a moment, I almost felt something, a twinge of an ache deep within my chest. Regrets? Sorrow, perhaps? I reached out and swept a stray hair from her face. No matter. When Clara's eyes cracked open, the sensation passed. Damon? Her voice shook when she regained enough of her senses to speak. What's happening? Where am I? Her arms strained against the straps. What are you doing? Only what I must, I replied, reaching under the table to show her the empty bottle with a new label, the gold-flowing script I chose in her honor. Clara, I read, letting my finger trace the letters. Beautiful label, don't you agree? Clara's eyes flicked to my old surgical tools laid out beside her on the tray, and her skin turned pale. But I don't think she really understood what was about to happen. Not until I took up the scalpel she threatened with me so playfully earlier and dipped it in the alcohol. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Damon, stop. You don't know what you're doing. You don't want to do this. You love me. Clara's voice trembled. And I love you. I tipped the silver blade back, pressing the point against my lip as I considered everything that led to this moment. The Tinder accounts and all that followed. All the carefully orchestrated steps I took to ensure that her heart would belong to me and me alone. The months I spent planning, drawing her in with perfect precision. Yes, I know you do. I turned around and tightened the straps binding her to the table, pausing only long enough to watch a single tear trace down her cheek. I tilted my head to the side and laid the knife along her skin to catch it on the blade. If you didn't, then your sacrifice would be useless. I lifted the knife, allowing the teardrop to dangle from the edge. You see, Clara, the scalpel did not belong to my grandfather, or his. It is mine. It has always been mine. I've kept these tools all these years, to remind me of what I was before. She whimpered and struggled against her bonds, but it was a frail attempt. She couldn't help but love me. Not anymore. Her love was unconditional, real, pure. I slipped my arm free of my sleeve, sliced open a thin line at the base of my wrist, infecting my immortal soul with her weakness, her strength. It burned. A sharp breath stabbed at my lungs as the sensation took hold. Sadness, betrayal, fear, and love. Emotions so strong I hadn't felt their like for over 1,000 years. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I needed to feel it again, to experience what she felt every time she looked at me, every time she thought of me. The pain faded, the emotions passed, and Clara's face came back into focus, open-mouthed and trembling. I am Rene Linux descendant. I am he. I was turned many centuries ago, but contrary to legend, vampires don't drink blood to stay alive, I told her. I drink it so that I may live, so I can experience emotion and pass as human. But you are quite special to me, Clara. I reached under the sink attached to the foot end of the table, opened the valve to the tank it fed, and placed the point of the blade just under her ribcage. Your blood will ensure my humanity for a long time to come. I braced my other hand on the butt of the hilt, preparing for the initial cut, bracing myself against the scent of blood to come.
The Brazilian name for the red fish, known among scientific circles as the arapaima. If you've never heard of the red fish before now, then prepare yourself, because you won't be forgetting it anytime soon. Imagine a living torpedo, pushing 10 feet and 500 pounds of bone, muscle, and iron-hard scales. Imagine a primordial, upturned, snake-like head, helming a sleek, tapering body behind it, sporting drab olive green on its flanks that melds into vibrant floral red as it approaches its scallop-shaped tail. Now, give this creature a psychological addiction to power and speed, and an unyielding temper to match. To put it another way, people have died from this fish, being struck by their solid bony heads as they jump. With cracked skulls or ruptured lungs, they fall out of their boats and sink, unable to draw breath. Darkness and turbulent mud, the last thing they see before the light snuffs out. Those who survive an attack walk away with broken bones, scarred hearts, and a healthy newfound fear literally hammered into them. In terms of diet, however, they only eat small animals. Humans are off the menu. Their aggressive responses are triggered when they feel cornered, or during the breeding season when protecting their young. But in my opinion, that doesn't make it much better. Consider this. Which animal would impart the worst death? The one that kills for food because it has to? Or the one whose only concern is ensuring its own survival by any means necessary? That's what we were after. That's what motivated our endeavor of greed and destruction. That's what led to where we are today. Here and there, all over the place, spread out so thin, we'll never be put back together. Acquisitors is the term I'd use to describe ourselves. Our organization existed solely to provide covert resources in the acquisition of whatever it was we were paid to nab. Laws, politics, socioeconomic status. It mattered not to us, as long as the client followed through with the price we quoted. After that, it was no questions asked. We did what we needed to follow through on our word. No double standards. No acknowledged pleasantries. Point A to point B. Depending on the jobs we carried out, and those who fell victim to our work, we were given a host of other labels, each nastier than the rest. Mercenaries, traffickers, thieves, assassins, and in the case of the red fish, poachers. I perfectly remember the conversation I had earlier that day. The palace seemed to breathe gold with its gilded pillars and cavernous hallways that swam in dim candlelight. Private security guards led me down the corridors to my client's den, an opulent office space adorned with expensive frescoes and cages of exotic birds. Behind the client's desk was a window the size of a small house, overlooking the Essequibo River, gleaming silver and yellow in the rising sun. The whole place stank of exploitation and arrogance. I gazed at the rosewood walls rising 2 stories above, almost hearing the cries of the animals and trees that had once called this plot of land home. But I hadn't come here to judge. My client regarded me with a stony expression as I sat down. Maybe he thought the live jaguar dozing on his desk between us would be intimidating, to give him some kind of edge over me. But I met his face with a similar blankness. It would take more than a jungle cat to impress me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here," he said. He gestured around his den. "You like it?" "It's, very grandiose," I settled with. "Very," he agreed. "Spared no expense. I have the will and I have the means. Who am I to deny what I want?" He scratched the jaguar's ears, who replied with a syrupy growl. "Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, there are still things in this world that elude me. Have you heard of the Pirarucu, gringo?" "Red fish," I answered. "Yeah, I know of it." "Mana of the gods," he said wistfully. "One fish can feed a village for a week. And for the more inclined towards the culinary arts, they make for the most wonderful seared steaks. I tell you, man, I have sampled beasts from all over the world, and none compared to the Pirarucu." His tone hardened. "But the local government does not respect my tastes. As we speak, our representatives, and I do use that term loosely, are ratifying laws banning the harvesting of the red fish. Try as I might, I cannot sway a coalition of progressive bureaucrats. And all this is on the heels of a biannual feast I throw for my friends in this beautiful palace. Every 6 months, I serve prime Pirarucu cuts to my guests. It's the only thing I can exclusively offer to them. But if I cannot get what I want this time, then I have no leverage, no standing." He stood up, pacing around his desk. "I refuse to be anything less than I have proven to be. I need to uphold my image. I need the red fish." "You want me to illegally capture and bring back a wild, Pirarucu," I guessed. "Hit the nail on the head," he confirmed, punching to stroke the jaguar's flank. I nodded. I never thought I'd have to play a glorified fisherman in my line of work, but work was work, and I dwelled on it no further. "Sounds straightforward enough. Can you possibly tell me where I can find them?" "Actually, I can," my client said, straightening up. "Upriver, about 20 miles, is a reserve, for lack of a better term. A tract of wetland some liberal environmentalist types have set up for the Pirarucu. Probably American," he added with distaste. "The red fish is rare enough in these parts already. Way I see it, you can scour the jungle for days, rooting through lakes and swamps in the off chance you find a suitable specimen. Or you could sneak into the reserve, slip past the Americans, and just pick one up, like it was a bag of groceries. I briefly considered the options. Expediency is my MO, I said. Me and my men will infiltrate that reserve and find you the biggest, fattest Piraruku they have. No one will stand in our way. My client smiled and held out his hand. You, sir, you're one of the good ones. The journey upriver could not have gone any smoother. I gathered together a crew of contacts stationed in the country, all dressed in civilian attire. We were to pose as a group of old friends, reuniting in Guyana for a bit of sport fishing along the river. Quote, unquote, just like we used to. We'd take the ferry up to the tributary, claiming we wanted to fish the point where it merged with the main channel, then slowly make our way up until we hit the entrance to the reserve. The gear bags and tackle boxes we brought along with us, in fact, held spear guns, crossbows, and pistols. We hoped the first two weapons would be all we needed to quickly and stealthily obtain a Piraruku. The pistols would only be if things got out of hand. The trip ate up most of the morning. The only noteworthy thing was the chatterbox of a ferryman who took to probing our crew about what we were doing. I handled all the talking. What are you all fishing for? He inquired. Payara and Trahira, realistically, I answered. And if we're lucky, Surubim. Ah, of course, he exclaimed. So, you're not going after the Piraruku? I feigned confusion. Excuse me? I don't know any other name. It's the big fish with a red tail that jumps. Oh, you mean the Arapaima, I said. No, we're not equipped for those guys. Good, said the ferryman, turning dour. They're on the brink, my friend. Thankfully, they're about to pass laws to protect them. And it was only because of the tribesmen that our gutless politicians finally went through with it. They're tribesmen? I asked, legitimately interested this time. Yes, some indigenous tribes sent ambassadors to come out and try to convince our representatives to help them to protect the Piraruku, he explained. The fish is important for their spiritual practices, see? And they're being wiped out faster than they can keep up with. Guess we're just too damn good at what we do. He shook his head disdainfully, plundering the river of its resources. I mulled over this new information as he gabbed away. I wondered if the American activists had somehow garnered an agreement with these native tribes to build the reserve together. Only now do I realize how foolish that sentiment was. We disembarked at our stop, 6 of us, 3 per dugout canoe, and paddled up the fateful tributary. The tropical sun was sweltering as we forced ourselves up the channel. It was nearing the end of the dry season. The water was muddy and winding, barely deep enough for our boats in some spots. This was preferable, though. Low waters meant the fish would be contained in isolated pockets, and considering their air-breathing habits, they'd be easy to spot whenever they broke the surface. Jagged, protruding rocks and fallen trees only slightly impeded our progress. We found ourselves occasionally having to drag our canoes over dry land to pass up a barrier, but with 6 men and rates I promised them as payment, nothing was too much for us. The final barrier, a few miles up, piqued my interest. Sharpened wooden pikes jutted from the water facing downstream, like the spiked walls of a moat. Someone had definitely placed them there to keep trespassers out. I stood up in my perch, peering over the pikes. Beyond, the water tapered out into a vast wetland lined with tall grass. "We're here," I said. That's when something pricked me in the neck. I scarcely had time to pluck the thing from my skin when toxic drowsiness overtook my senses. My fingers went limp, and the dart slipped from my grasp into the water. I collapsed, my vision blackening, watching the rest of my crew shudder and fall with me before everything went cold and dark. The sight before us made me wish I had never woken up. I first realized the 6 of us had been stripped and bound, hands knotted with vines behind our backs, forced into a kneeling position on the forest floor. I felt a scalding heat on my face. The very air seemed to shimmer before me, on account of the blazing campfire in front of us, its green wood emitting acrid black smoke. It was still the daytime, early afternoon, so I could easily see our captors surrounding us. One look told me they were indigenous, short, toned, clad only in leaves and loincloths, their deep red skin painted over with vivid black and white skeletal patterns. They sneered and hissed, scepters and spears bristling in their grips. My heart sank. I hadn't prepared for the possibility of such a swift ambush. My client had claimed we'd only be dealing with American activists, not exactly the fighting type. What the ferryman told me suddenly fell into place. The reserve belonged to them. And the Americans, if there even were any, might have met their fates at their hands. "What do you want with us?" I croaked, my throat stinging from the fumes. A bizarre exchange erupted to my left. Someone rasped in what I could only assume to be the tribe's language. A second voice responded in the same tongue. "You came here to hunt the redfish?" The first voice wheezed. I forced myself to look. It took all my willpower not to shout. Strung up between 2 tribesmen was an emaciated nude white man, his long hair matted and tangled. His lips were cracked, and his eyes were empty, putrescent sockets. To my sustained horror, I saw hollow vines had been stuck under the skin of his sore-ridden arms, vines that ran up to fluid-filled sacks made of leaves, toted by the tribesmen flanking him. A primitive IV system. They were keeping him just barely alive. To translate. "No!" I yelled, my voice strangled. "We wanted to fish for surubim." The same double exchange. "We searched your bags," the translator snapped. "You do not need spear guns or firearms to hunt surubim." "We use handguns when fishing in Alaska," I countered, thinking on my feet. "We put down halibut once we bring them in our boats. The surubim are no different." The exchange. "You've proven yourself fit for nothing but lies," the translator said. "That will be 1 bullet for each lie." One of the tribesmen stepped forward and stuck out his arm. I barely registered one of our guns in his hand before he pressed it to one of the men's foreheads and pulled the trigger. The spray of blood hadn't even settled before he executed the next man. We panicked and struggled against our bonds, showered by a fine mist of salty blood. But the tribesman emptied the magazine into the air, the concussive ringing bangs finally forcing us into silence. "Best start talking the truth, or they'll water the ground with the rest of your brains," the translator leered. All right, I gasped, fighting the rising whine in my ear. Yes, we came to find a redfish, but nothing more than that. All we need is one. If you have a sickly one or even a dead one, that is all that we want. We won't venture here again. We won't tell anyone about you. The exchange. Pillagers and parasites. That's all you are, the translator growled. This forest has suffered enough without you worms slowly killing it with just one more piece. We have no loyalty to our clients, I said. We are only doing the job we were hired to do. Mere agents of circumstance. We have no stake in either side. We don't deserve your righteous anger. Please. All I ask is to work with me here. The exchange. If all you seek is a single red fish, then capture one if you can, said the translator. But you will face the gauntlet. You will crawl through the muck like a small, pathetic creature. He interpreted more vocal growls from the tribesmen. Make it to the end of the reserve, and you're free to go. But if you have no red fish, you must leave without one and never come back. All the while, we will hunt you. Even as our captors reached down to undo our bonds, scrambled thoughts raged in my mind. I had been in more dangerous situations in the past, but never one where I had been so helpless, so stripped of my faculties. I couldn't imagine my contacts had ever found themselves in such dire straits either. Finishing the job was one thing, but staying alive to actually follow through was something I rarely had to consider. Until today. We give you no fanfare, the translator said. Start running. A tribesman knocked an arrow. We bolted, vaulting over the headless corpses of a third of our party. Cruel, mocking laughter followed us as we barreled through the clearing and into the dense cover of trees. The arrow lodged in a trunk barely a foot from my head. The further in we ran, the wetter and flatter the ground became, until we were up to our shins in muddy, putrid swamp water. We stopped, straining to listen out for approaching hunters in the distance. Apart from our sharp, labored panting, we seemed to be alone. The other 3 men took their time to catch their breath. Then, they all turned and glared at me. What the fuck was that about? One of them snapped. A man whom I only knew by his code name, Gamma. Because of you, 2 of us are dead back there, Delta concurred. Did you know we'd be facing armed hostiles? Epsilon demanded. I was never told about any of this, I protested. Apparently, our client was misinformed. Or lied, Gamma muttered. None of that matters now, Epsilon interjected. What matters is what we do from here. If we get out of the reserve, they will stop hunting us. The pikes are about a mile south. We can make it if we run. Belay that, I said, stepping up to him. They're giving us a chance. And if we don't deliver what we promised to our client, we don't get paid. And we get blacklisted upon our return. We'll die trying to catch one of those fish, said Delta. You would rather die than get out of this mess alive? I have never failed a client yet, I said. And I am not going to let some fucked up indigenous types get in my way. We are outgunned and outnumbered, Gamma snarled. They won't hesitate to kill us. If they wanted us dead, it would have been so by now, I reasoned. I looked past them, back the way we came. They are toying with us. They don't believe we can make it, much less apprehend one of their precious red fish. Frankly, I'd like to spit in their faces, on both accounts. Your pride will lead us to our deaths, said Delta. The risk of death was always part of this job, I retorted. What the hell did you think you signed on for? I don't fear death, said Gamma. What I fear is being sentenced to death under false pretenses by ignorant, dishonest clients. Once that trust is breached, consider my services null and void." Epsilon and Delta grunted in agreement. I gaped at them. "Gentlemen, we are supposed to be the best of the best, cutthroat, elite, what they turn to when no one else will fit the bill. You renege on this now, and it's over for you. For all of us." The three of them glared at me. For a moment, I thought they'd consider it. A tribal shout echoed from the woods, and they snapped over to look at it, then back at me. "Oh, not like this," said Epsilon. "Naked, misled, undignified." He averted his gaze and trudged away. Delta and Gamma followed him. I kept quiet, opting to stick to the back of the group. Unbeknownst to them, I was seething, mouthing silent curses at their backs. I, myself, would bring back a Piraruku to spite them. To spite them all. The further we pushed, the higher the water crept up our bodies until we were waist-deep in stained, foul-smelling swamp. Brambles and gnarled bushes stuck out from the surface, requiring us to squeeze through or duck under walls of branches. More than before, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Submerged thorns poked at my bare thighs, and the occasional unseen object brushed against my more delicate bits. I tried not to imagine the sensitive skin down there, snagging on an underwater thorn and ripping free. I should have been grateful that it was only so shallow. During the wet season, the water level would be 50 feet higher. Caimans and anacondas would be swimming nearly 4 stories above us otherwise. The other 3 pretended as though I weren't there, which I didn't mind in the slightest. I'd have some less than kind things to say about them once I killed a Piraruku and brought it back myself. Oh, dark, delicious satisfaction. Despite the circumstances, a laugh yearned to jump free from my chest. I wanted to watch their sorry faces as they choked on humble pie. The red fish became more than just a job for me. It became validation. Finally, the vegetation thinned out, and our party wound up in a chest-deep lagoon. A quick glance at the sun confirmed we were still going south, towards the pikes, but more submerged trees blocked the horizon beyond. Apparently, the reserve stretched on for longer than we'd thought. As we pushed forward, I noticed something that the other men were too committed to see. Soft, swirling ripples sporadically formed at the surface. In these parts, it could have been any number of creatures, but somehow, I knew they were the telltale signs of Piraruku, taking lungfuls of air. I lingered, watching the men fan out ahead of me. I could feel sharp, solid branches buried in the muck below my feet. If I could fashion one of those into a spear. Lost in thought, the ground below me suddenly gave way, and I sank past my nose. Sputtering, I kicked off and forced myself to tread. I stroked through the water, looking around for the others, but they were still walking, the water at their chests. And within a few seconds, my feet met submerged ground once more. I must have wandered through a depression or a hole of some kind. I looked around at the others, and sure enough, Epsilon seemed to bob in the water for a moment before finding his footing again. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching down and scraping up something from the water. The moment his hand broke the surface, I knew we were fucked. I only saw the sunlight passing through the eggs slipping between his fingers before the surface next to him exploded. Epsilon cried out in pain, clutching his right shoulder and kicking off from his attacker. The way his arm hung limp told me it was dislocated from a large, fast, blunt force. We're in their fucking nests! I screamed, strafing to the side. Spread out! Away from the center! Delta and Gamma propelled themselves away from the fray. Epsilon could only manage an ungainly, half-treading movement. Even in the cloudy water, I could see his own destruction in his wake. A cloud of dislodged fish eggs, spiraling in the whirls he was making. Claps of water snapped next to him. Get to the trees! I commanded. As Delta and Gamma reached for the overhanging boughs, I fished a broken branch from the silt and set off after him. It was flimsy and short, next to useless as a weapon. But even if I could just injure one of the Piraruku, I could both save Epsilon and pursue a then crippled fish. I saw the whirl before it jumped. Hot instinct took over, and I sidestepped in the water. A foaming torrent flared up, and I saw it. A living missile with beady, pitch-black eyes, long as I was tall, slicing through open air like it was nothing. A whip of wind slashed my cheek as it streaked past and splashed into the water behind me. A foot to my right, and it would have taken off my head. I tried to curse, but all that came out was a strangled yelp. My vision tunneled, and I forced myself forward, trying to get to Epsilon, who had almost reached a submerged tree, facing backwards and kicking at his pursuers. Just beyond the range of his flailing feet, one rocketed from the water and struck him square in the chest. Even from a distance, I saw his ribs collapse. A single, deathly puff of air expelled from his mouth, followed swiftly by a dribble of blood. Capillaries burst in his eyes as he choked one last time. Then he sank below the surface. It killed him, I told myself. My God, it fucking killed him. The flimsy waterlogged stick in my grasp seemed even more useless. Commotion behind me welled up. I whipped around to find Gamma and Delta had hoisted themselves up a tree out of the water, but the branches were splitting under their grasps. Below, the muddy water churned with a looming fish. Higher! Delta growled, hurling himself upwards. His branch snapped and hung limp by a few sinews, but he had secured a grip on a higher bough. One-handed, the man curled his arm and threw his upper body over the branch, his bare feet a good 2 meters from the water. Gamma lowered himself to build momentum and pull the same stunt, but his branch snapped. He plunged into the water, still maintaining his death grip. Once again, a few sinews kept the branch attached to the tree, and he scrambled to try and climb it like a rope. A monstrous Piraruku lanced through the air and sliced through the man's face like butter. Gamma's head dropped to the side, but I could clearly see the gaping hole where his lower jaw once was, shiny and ragged with torn flesh. A broad stripe of red gushed down his exposed front. His fingers loosened. He slid down the branch agonizingly slow, crashing into the water. Blood clouded from his lifeless corpse, which immediately roiled with tiny, scavenging fry. Oh, fuck me, I gasped. The lagoon had been churned into a turbulent cauldron of mud and blood, but I saw no more signs of surfacing Piraruku. I signaled silently to Delta, pointing from him to the line of dense cover at the lagoon's far end. As he navigated through the branches, keeping clear of the water's surface, I lowered past my nose and waded forward as smoothly as possible. My heartbeat amplified in the water, nothing short of a signaling drum for any more Piraruku. But nothing more disturbed the surface. Apparently, we'd moved past their nests at that point. I met Delta at the tree line. The swamp stretched far beyond their twisted trunks, but at least the water level was in our waists now. He lowered himself down from the branches and splashed in front of me with a simmering glare. Still vying to take down one of those beasts? he said coldly. Silence yourself and savor whatever shred of dignity you have left, I snapped. Those things cut our party in half in less than a minute, Delta growled. Dignity is out of the question. You and I are next. I pray I can at least watch you die first. Rage bled in me and I splashed over to him, grabbing his forearm. Why not just fucking kill me? Now! Reap the satisfaction! Delta didn't resist. He simply stared at me with the coolest of expressions. Because you're just not worth it. I shoved him away but responded no further. As angry as I was, I couldn't deny that he was correct. To an extent. Without proper weapons, taking out a Piraruku in their turf would be suicide. There were 2 bodies in the lagoon north of us who could attest to that. Completing this mission never before felt more nebulous. I never admitted to Delta, but simply getting out alive seemed the most pragmatic option. I've been trained to think outside the box, to improvise, to always be 2 steps ahead of the game. But now, I felt truly trapped, unable to think beyond what I could immediately see. The tribesmen didn't think we could do it. Time was proving them more and more right. To our left, something rustled in the bushes. Delta and I whipped around to look, but the undergrowth was too dense. A hoarse whisper cut through the brush, the tribesmen's native language. Move, I said. They said they'd be hunting us too. The unseen warrior shouted something, and a horribly familiar noise erupted in response. Oh fuck, go, go, go! I shouted. Delta and I submerged, breaststroking through the water, dipping underneath the overhanging branches. 2 splashes sounded off somewhere behind us, followed by the sharp, noisy slaps of dog paddling. We arrived at a fallen tree and dove underneath it. The log's slimy underside grazed past our backs, and we emerged unscathed about 15 feet beyond it. I shot a glance behind me. They jumped on top of the log, 2 huge, muscular, tawny pit bulls with red-tinted eyes and black lips jagged and torn from barking. They caught sight of us, their teeth gleaming like sabers. Then, they sprung into the water, panting and paddling towards us. Under! Delta shouted. We both submerged, scattering in separate directions. I felt around more than I saw, pulling and squeezing my way past sunken roots. With my sense of touch heightened, I detected the dog's wake before it could strike. I wheeled around, stirring up a cloud of silt, and I saw pale eyes and a maw of canine teeth emerge from the gloom. I thrust my hand below its mouth. I grasped the wet fur of its throat and hung on. The dog struggled and writhed, spinning underwater and dragging me along, all the while snapping its ravening jaws at me, mere inches from my face, bubbles streaming, eyes rolling, paws clawing at my exposed arms and stomach. It kicked to the surface. Sunlight and clean air hit me and I gasped for breath. The pit bull emerged next, still held at arm's length, its barks like railgun blasts in my face. It paddled forward, pushing me through the water until my back crashed into a tree. The dog slashed and clawed, overpowering my arm's strength, inching closer and closer to my throat. With a bellow, I thrust my free arm through the air and drove my thumb into its eye. It yelped and yanked its neck from my grasp, half blinded and paddling off. I looked around for Delta. It was 20 feet off from me, locked in a similar half-submerged battle with the second pit bull. I swam forward to help. When I reached them, I grabbed the scruff of the dog's neck and yanked it off Delta, who was scratched up. and bleeding freely into the water. I primed my arm to gouge the second dog's eyes. The first dog lunged from behind and seized my wrist. The pain was excruciating, like a car door with nails, and I let go, letting the force carry me backwards and underwater once more. I heard screams above the surface. Before the bones in my wrist could crack, the first dog let go and pursued Delta along with the second. Survival overruled. I kicked off away from the fray, resurfacing some 10 feet off, my wrist burning with agony. Delta and the two dogs had been reduced to a watery frenzy of limbs, blood, barks, and screams. The man got in a few blows, signaled by the high-pitched yelps and the flying tufts of fur, but within seconds, the fur was replaced with human flesh, and Delta's struggling form devolved into a dismembered mangle of red. His screams silenced. Fighting the urge to vomit, I simply turned and swam south, towards freedom. The pit bulls did not follow, perhaps too weakened or too preoccupied to do so. Once several yards and more undergrowth separated us, I stopped to catch my breath, my injured wrist trembling. My vision overturned, my head was fuzzy with adrenaline. I had grown to hate my crew, but I hadn't wanted them to pay like this. The red fish was supposed to do that. I was supposed to do that. I'd wanted them to feel the misery of defeat and humiliation. Now, the red fish meant nothing to me. Nothing but a cold reminder of all that had put us through this mess. I continued onward through the undergrowth. If the opportunity presented itself, I would take it. But otherwise, getting out alive was now the goal. I emerged into another lagoon. This time, the setting was recognizable. At the far end, the water narrowed into a channel blocked off by sharp pikes. I looked around. I appeared alone. I could make it across, leave the reserve. They would let me live. Redfish or no redfish, I was going to make it. As I swam forward, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. An overturned canoe floating in the water before me, surrounded by surfacing Pararuku. My mind immediately drew a connection. Much like how floating debris in the open ocean attracted seafaring fish, this abandoned canoe seemed to serve as a gathering point for Pararuku. And they hadn't noticed me. If I could sneak up on one and catch one, just one by surprise, I'd have the edge. Holding on and dispatching it would be another story, but I tried not to think about it as I entered stealth mode and approached the canoe. The fish continued to surface regularly, 30 feet. My motions were careful and calculated. Only my eyes and forehead were visible above the water. 20 feet. They still seemed preoccupied with the canoe. The boat was dark in color, not the same ones we had arrived in several hours earlier. Was it one of the tribesmen's canoes? What was it doing overturned in the middle of the lagoon in the first place? At 10 feet, the fish scattered. I slapped at the water, belting out a string of curses. It was over. I lacked the energy to pursue them further, and the longer I lingered, the more likely the tribesmen would find some other way to kill me. Then, the canoe moved. It swiveled in the water to face me. That's when I saw the pattern of scales, the organic way the sunlight reflected off of it. It sank. A red, scallop-shaped tail the size of a sewer grate swirled through the water above it before it disappeared. Oh, God. was all I could muster. The water below transformed into a suction. I was too paralyzed to resist. I sank feet first below the surface, watching helplessly as my legs disappeared into the Leviathan Piraruku's gaping mouth. I caught sight of its black eyes, unfeeling, uncaring, before my head slipped past its bony lips. Within a second, I was encased in a black, fleshy, watery coffin. True fear set in. I thought back to my crew, the violent progression of death that had whittled us down, each more hideous than the last, ending with me being swallowed alive by an outlandishly huge red fish. The muscles in its throat contracted, squeezing me further down its gullet. I gave up. I waited for the sting of stomach acid, the strangling noxiousness of gas. Instead, what I got was light, not sunlight. This was a deep, hellish red. I couldn't determine where it was coming from. I assumed it was a hallucination, induced from a lack of oxygen. But I could clearly see the inside of the fish illuminated around me, the pulsating walls of its guts, the outline of its spine and ribs dripping with moisture. And there were others. There were others inside the fish with me. I rolled over onto my stomach and screamed. 5 bodies below me, all staring up in differing states of grotesqueness. 2 with shattered foreheads, 1 bleeding from the mouth, 1 with his lower jaw missing, and 1 nearly torn apart, his muscles and organs exposed. My men. For the first time in my life, I broke. I closed my eyes and shrieked, beating at the organic wall around me, the cadavers below, my own flesh, crying for deliverance, an end, a mercy killing to take me away from whatever fresh hell this was. I don't remember much else after that. All I know is at some point I ended up outside the reserve, back where we started. Our canoes were still there, having run aground on the sloping bank. I stood far up the shoreline, watching as more boats showed up at the pikes. They were slick, motorized, definitely government vessels. Military police jumped from the boats regarding our abandoned canoes before crossing over inside the reserve. They didn't look at me once. I doubt they even noticed me. I doubt that they could have noticed me. Instead, their attention was drawn to something in the lagoon beyond the pikes. It was a corpse, floating face down. From my distance, I couldn't tell whose body it was. It could have been mine, for all I knew. "Yep, it's one of them," one of the soldiers confirmed. "Matched the description the fireman gave us." "All they wanted to do was go fishing," another said, shaking his head. "Those goddamn savages," a third growled. "See how far the little deal goes now." Brandishing their carbines, they stalked deeper into the reserve. A day later, drifting among the crowds of the local town, I learned that with the murders of the 6 fishermen, the deal between the politicians and the indigenous tribesmen had dissolved. The proposed law protecting the Piraruku was tossed. and the tribe responsible for their deaths had been neutralized. The atmosphere in the town was of celebration, with no more encroaching regulations and no indigenous tribes to worry about. Local fishermen were readying their harpoons and nets to set out and take advantage of the surprise bounty. Some expressed their concerns, warning that the sudden influx of fishing pressure would irrevocably damage the Pirarucu populations, leading to their extinction from the area. But the red fish's allure was too strong to grant them any credence. A few of these fishermen, I noticed, were showing off their new toys: spear guns, dynamite, canisters of poison, things they couldn't have gotten without a little outside help. It didn't take long to guess who in the region had the money and the motivation to fund their missions. I guess my client was right in the end. With the will and the means, who was he to deny what he wanted? Suddenly, Gamma's suspicions about having been lied to made sense. I couldn't stop them if I tried. Greed had overtaken them. They were beyond saving. Mindless husks set out to reap the Pirarucu. In the end, there'd only be one winner, and I hated him for it. Instead, all I could do was wonder what would become of them. I found myself wishing my fate upon them all. A stripping, a gauntlet, suffering. And finally, to cap it all off, ravenous, all-consuming death. Hopefully, in the end, they'd learn to realize the futility of their endeavors. Maybe they'd end up like me, something less than flesh, more than idea, an imprint of sin, a shade. Hopefully, they'd learn to finally respect the red fish.
Chilling tales for dark nights.